So thank you all for being here and for all the speakers for being here. And yes, welcome to this morning's training on homelessness and harm reduction in the times of COVID-19. We are really happy to see so many people joining us today and interested in this topic. And we are really happy to welcome our four expert speakers today, Christina Love, Annie Murray, Brian Wilson, and Robin Dempsey. The Alaska Native Tribal Health Consortium has an ambitious vision that Alaska Native people are the healthiest people in the world. And this vision is rooted in the strength of Alaska Native people and culture. This training is brought to you by two programs within our Wellness and Prevention Department, and that promotes wellness through culturally responsive prevention services. And the two departments, as I mentioned, are the Substance Misuse and HIV STD Prevention Program. And where these programs come together is through one of the ways is through our website called I Know Mine. And in that website, we have a lot of free prevention resources like testing kits and educational materials, harm reduction kits. And so please feel free to have a look there. The site is just on the slide. To see what resources could be helpful for your community. And so this is our last harm reduction training for the spring. And during these trainings, we've been discussing harm reduction strategies and resources in Alaska, and we've been bringing in really wonderful guest speakers from throughout Alaska that work in using various methods of harm reduction. And so the goal ultimately is to increase the well-being of the individuals living in our communities by reducing the harms associated with drug use. So last but not least, we have our expert speakers. And we're going to start with Christina Love. She's a substance use disorder and trauma specialist at the Alaska Network on Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. We have Annie Murray, who is the Coordinated Entry Manager at the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. Brian Wilson, who's the Executive Director of Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness. And Robin Dempsey, who is the Chief Program Officer at Catholic Social Services. And yes, we thank you all so much for being here and sharing your experiences and knowledge. So I'm going to start by handing it off to Christina.
Oyana Gunishjish. My name is Christina Love. My family's from Igigik. I was raised in Chittenden, Alaska, and I'm coming to you today from Juneau, which is home of the Ak and Taku Kwan of the Tlingit Nation. We are here on the beautiful Tlingit Ani. So I'm going to start by talking about Alaska Native people and homelessness. And I think it's my personal and professional mission. I know it's my personal and professional mission as an Alaska Native woman who has experienced homelessness, incarceration, poverty, multiple types of violence, including domestic violence and sexual assault. It is so important that we give context. We often see that Alaska Native people represent the largest population, and hopefully we will answer some of those questions today. Next slide. Alaska's homelessness management information system it's referred to as HMIS, if you've ever wondered. So that collects data for 6 program types. That includes emergency shelters, homeless prevention, transitional housing, rapid rehousing, and permanent supportive housing. And in 2018, they reviewed for racial disparities. And so this assessment examines racial representation within the homeless population compared to the general population, as well as the length of stays, the exit outcomes by program type and race. And so persons of color are extraordinarily overrepresented as a proportion of the homeless population when compared to the general population. Alaska Native people represent about 16% of the general population, but they comprise 30.24% of the population accessing homeless services. Next slide. Housing firsts are extremely limited in Alaska compared to the needs that exist statewide. White Alaskans are nearly twice as likely to be referred to permanent supportive housing or rapid rehousing beds compared to Alaska Native people. In 2018, Go ahead and click the first one. In 2018, 13.3% of white clients accessing rapid rehousing or permanent supportive housing versus 7.1% of Alaska Native people. But when we're comparing VSPDAT, is how we refer to it. It's the Vulnerability Index Service Prioritization Decision Assistance Tool. When we're administrating that to both individuals and families to determine the risk and prioritizing when providing assistance to people who are experiencing homeless, what we found was that the scores for both races, there were very little difference. Click the next one. As you can see, 48.3% for non-Indigenous and 45.4% for Alaska Native people. Next slide. So when looking at the program exit destinations, Alaska Native clients were far less likely to exit into permanent housing destinations than non-Natives. In 2018, over half of white clients, 52.26, exited into permanent housing compared to only 33.99%. Next slide. There's racial disparities in the collection of exit destination data as well, with a greater percentage of Alaska Native persons leaving without a destination. And so that means that when we are, whether that's a harm reduction plan, what we found was that 97% compared to non-Indigenous 45.26%. These are huge, huge, huge gaps. Next slide. There's also racial disparity percentages in clients accessing homeless prevention resources. One of the Alaska Native clients only at 16.7 accessing homeless prevention resources compared to 30.4% of white clients. And so this is, this leaves us to a couple of really big questions about why. Next slide. So why do Alaska Native people experience homelessness? And we just saw they're experiencing disparities at sometimes 50% compared to non-Indigenous, and discrimination more than the other population. And this coincides with the other questions. Why do Alaska Native people experience sexual assault at higher rates? Why do they experience domestic violence at higher rates? Why are we killing ourselves at higher rates than any other population? And the answer is one that I think for a lot of Indigenous people comes very naturally, but for the other population, it's incredibly important that we talk about. Next slide. 84.3%. So contemporary reality for sexual assault in our communities. According to the Department of Justice, the federal government's own statistics shows that 84% of Native women have been victims of violence in their lifetime. We know that the state average is 1 in 2. One out of 2 of every single woman in the entire state, now that's Indigenous and non-Indigenous, will experience physical violence, sexual violence, or both. This is the government's own statistics shows that 56% of Native women have experienced sexual violence. Next slide. Making these statistics 10 times the national average, which we've known for a really long time. We also have other compounding harm, next slide, that shows that 29.3% of our Native LGBTQ community are experiencing hate crimes. So on top of being physically and sexually abused, we also have another addition of type of harm. And that goes the same for, next slide, for our LGBTQ bisexual community. They're showing 85% have experienced sexual violence. And if you remember from our first slide of sexual violence, this is a little bit higher. So they're experiencing higher rates of sexual violence. Next slide. So the rate at which we're being abused is just as alarming as who's responsible for the harm. This is a really, really important myth to dispel. Unlike women of every other race, Alaska Native women, Alaska Native women, and this shows men, are being physically assaulted and sexually assaulted by people who are not Native American or Alaska Native. And when we look at non-Native persons who are sexually assaulted, this is what is considered a hate crime. When we're looking at this numbers such as this, for women, that shows 97%, and for men, that's 90%. And that brings us to another really important bit of information. Next slide. This shows that that not just women are being abused, but also Alaska Native men and American Indian men. And that is 81.6% have experienced violence in their lifetime. 27.5% have experienced sexual violence. 43.2% have experienced physical violence by an intimate partner. 43% have experienced psychological aggression by an intimate partner. And if we remember from the slide before, that is not by other Indigenous people. And what this means is that we know that we have some communities in Alaska where children make up the highest rate of our sexual assault. 70% of all sexual assaults reported are on children. This means that violence is happening to the Native community on every single level. So that brings us to another really important question. And I'd like for you to type this in the chat box. Have Native communities always been impacted by violence? That's right. The answer is no, we have not. Not like this. Pre-contact, prior to Western, sorry, next slide. Prior to Western contact with Indigenous people, we refer to this as pre-contact. We had systems of laws, and you'll have to click through and follow me. We had systems of laws and government for thousands of years, and these systems worked really well for us. And what we found from our history, that traditional violence against women was absolutely not tolerated. We had strict laws and policies that prohibited the mistreatment of women, children, and elders. And tribal justice response to acts of violence was swift, and they were severely punished. Execution was the only use if a woman or child was harmed. Many of our tribal traditions were matriarchal, matrilineal, where the women were the community, were the center of the government. And not that women weren't harmed, but we have to think about the role that women played in the society. In traditional tribal societies, women were protected, they were honored, they were cherished. Women and children were considered sacred. They held esteemed positions within their nation. We didn't even have one word for rape, because it was seen as a violation to the entire community, a violation to body, a violation to spirit. And it's also important that we look at the history of women's sexuality, that sexuality was natural and that autonomy was respected. And most importantly, that women weren't seen as property of men. And we had individual and tribal sovereignty. Another thing to note is that two-spirit people were seen as matchmakers, prophesying, name conferring, that they also held sacred positions within the tribe. Sometimes they were referred to as medicine people. They were warriors, hunters, shamans, chief, but the most important part is that this didn't exclude them from traditional male or female roles. People were able to choose. And if we even look at the language, and that we see fluidity, within pronouns. A lot of the pronouns were they and them for everyone. This is a really incredible quote that Ephraim Webster, who was a fur trader and who was later adopted by the Onondaga people. Ephraim wrote, "The Indians have no altercations, and in 10 years I have not heard any angry expressions nor seen any degree of passion. They treat their women with respect, even tenderness. They use no ardent spirits. They settle differences amicably." This is so incredibly important. Next slide. Because this shows us that violence was not part of our culture. And when we look at parenting, like there's this incredible parenting book for Indigenous families that talks about how anger is a really dangerous emotion for children because it kills their spirit, and that it should never be used with children. So here's another big question. When did the crisis of sexual violence begin in America? And I apologize ahead of time. I'm going to give you a little bit of a warning. This next quote is really difficult. This next passage that we're going to look at is really difficult to listen to, but it is so important. And if you have any difficulty with it, please feel free to step away. So we know that next slide. The use of rape and violence during conquest and colonization demonstrates the European perception that Native American women are inferior. Being a Native woman during the period of European conquest came with many hardships. And one of those hardships result in inferiority in the subjugation to sexual violence and sexual assault and other degrading acts. When we look at the initial contact, we see rape was introduced immediately. There's a sense of entitlement to land, to women, and anything that European men wanted. And this is a picture of Columbus receiving a Native woman. Next slide. So Columbus brought with him his best friend, Michele di Cuonio, on his second voyage. Michele di Cuonio became the very first ever documented rapist in the New World. He wrote in his this letter to the voyage, he depicts an act of sexual assault toward a woman in what is considered a modern day Caribbean. So Michele di Cuonio describes the violence he inflicted on a Carib woman in his letter by stating, "I took a rope and thrashed her well." Furthermore, he asserts, "Finally, we came to an agreement." As the letter progresses, it becomes apparent that the Native American woman is in pain and can no longer fight to protect herself, and the actions between them are not consensual. The way that Cuonio so freely describes his experience with the Native woman validates the idea that he finds his unjust actions exciting and it gathers feelings of pride from them. In fact, Roger Barta emphasizes that men specifically chose untouched women so that they could feel perpetually guilty, and if it was consensual, then they would lose enjoyment. But this quote is so important because it reflects the privilege and the entitlement to women's bodies. Next slide. So we know that there was no discovery, that it was a Holocaust. And when we look at numbers that predate, Native Americans and indigenous populations were about 145 million, and as high as 145 million. And some I've seen 112. It's so difficult to be able to say where we were by 16, but we know for a fact that by 1691, 90 to 95%, so around 130 million people died. Winston Churchill and Standard went so far, and they said that that this indigenous genocide cannot be compared to any other genocides. He went so far to claim that Hitler was inspired by America's success at killing its indigenous people. Through this quote, "On the way to Auschwitz, the road's pathway led straight through the heart of the Indians, and of North and South America." We know that when genocide failed, that they looked at conquest, colonization, and assimilation. And some of those processes of conquest, colonization, and assimilation included the creation of boarding schools, not just Catholic boarding schools, but boarding schools. And that was some of the most brutal acts of violence. The breakdown of family and social systems, traditional forms of justice mostly eliminated the conquest of land and women, the diminished status of women, and the erosion of individual and tribal sovereignty. Next slide. This is a quote, and maybe you can guess who this is from. And so it says, "The object is simple and clear-cut: to extinguish tribal sovereignty, erase reservation boundaries, and force the assimilation of Indians into the society at large." And this is by our Supreme Court. And so the list that we just showed, those were all, when we go through history, and there's a long history of what happened, you know, in all of North America and here in Alaska. Next slide. But what we know from domestic violence and from other types of violence is that violence is a learned behavior. Which tells us that from our history to where we are, that colonizers were our very first perpetrators. This is so incredibly important because so much of this information is not found in history books, but we have to really think about why this is important. Next slide. From the statistics that I showed you before, and we're going to look at some other statistics, marginalized groups are disproportionately affected by poverty, homelessness, and incarceration. And maybe this is the most important slide out of all of them. Not because we commit more crimes or because we have greater rates of pathology, but because discrimination often keeps us from getting the same benefits enjoyed by members of the dominant culture. Next slide. This information is also important because Native Americans rank at or near the bottom of nearly every single health, social, and economic indicator. There was this meme that was going around social media that asked, "What's the most depressing statistic that you've ever seen?" And the answer is, for myself, that Alaska Native people, American Indian people are more likely to die before the age of 50, be physically assaulted, to be sexually assaulted, to be homeless, than they are to own a home or graduate from college. Next slide. We also know that American Indians and Alaska Native people are the most impoverished ethnic minority group in the US. Next slide. But without the context of what happened, then if we don't understand the full story and all we see is the effects, then we create this narrative that isn't true. And that's called confirmation bias. What this diagram shows us, when we look at harm that happens to an entire nation, right? That's the loss of identity, that's genocide, and how that impacts a community, disorganization, conflict, social problem, and how that community impacts a family dysfunction, domestic violence, helplessness, anger, grief, loss of children, how that family impacts an individual, low self-esteem, mental health, suicide, substance use disorder, and how that individual impacts their DNA. And that's called epigenetics. In the indigenous community, we call it blood memory. And that gets passed down from generation to generation. You can think of it like this. If you have a woman who is pregnant and addicted, and if she is not able to detox on her own and the baby's born, then the baby has to detox and that pain is transferred. And so pain that isn't processed, but first it has to stop. And the other important part of this diagram is that this shows us how an individual impacts a community and a nation, and how a nation and a community impacts an individual. Most importantly, next slide, that we all begin to understand that Alaska Native people are not morally flawed, that we are not weak, that we are not drunks, that we are not lazy, that we are surviving. And most importantly, that we're still here against all odds 500 years later, when the very first mandate that came out was to exterminate all Native people. The language that they wrote was ridding the body of its lice, cutting the weeds. They portrayed us as savages, and that's why language is so incredibly important. We know that language is often a precursor for genocide, but against all odds, we are still here, and we're writing another story, that we are more than, and that's what trauma-informed is important. And here later on, I'll talk about expanding that out to healing-centered practices. And that just means that we look at more, that I'm not just the violence that I've survived, that's not part of that we are more. Next slide. And for all of you to understand that the history has laid the groundwork for today, that every person would know and be able to answer why, when you drive downtown, you see more Native people there. And we work to make our systems and our services more accessible, because there is huge cost. And that's within all of us, the way that we see the world, the way that we talk, and the way that we interact. Next slide. Because all of us are what our ancestors prayed and dreamt of. And a time is coming for us to reclaim our story, our dignity. And I thank you. Thank you all very much. I think I went over time a little bit. Koyana Gunishish.
Thank you so much, Christina. And I don't know if you can see in the chat, but you have a lot of love and gratitude coming your way. So thank you so much for that incredible start to the training. So I'm going to now pass it on to Annie. So I will flip through and let you continue on from here.
Hi, everybody. I'm Annie, and yeah, thank you so much, Christina, for that incredibly important and valuable information that you shared. Yeah, we're so grateful to have you here. But yeah, I'm Annie. I work as the coordinated entry manager at the Anchorage Coalition to End Homelessness. I've been with the coalition for about 3 years, and I spent a couple of those years working directly with chronically homeless adults, helping them transition into permanent housing. And then for the past year or so, I've been in this role as the Coordinated Entry Manager. Next slide. So just a brief overview of ACH. Our kind of mission is to provide dynamic leadership to unite Anchorage in making homelessness rare, brief, and one time. Next slide. Yeah, ACH was developed back in 2004 as kind of a grassroots collaborative. We recognize that there was lots of people and organizations doing amazing work around homelessness, and that it would be helpful if we all came together yeah, with a common vision and all work together to achieve this goal of making homelessness rare, brief, and one time. So yeah, since 2017, when we hired our first staff person, we've been able to increase what we've been able to do, and now kind of serve as the backbone for the homeless prevention and response system. We partner with so many amazing people, some of whom I believe are on this call, to seek to achieve our mission. And we also kind of manage and oversee that data to empower providers to continue to work with their clients and to be able to recognize some of those inequities that exist and who is not being served and things like that, so that we can advocate and make changes and get additional funding and things like that. So that data piece is really important, even though sometimes it doesn't always feel super glamorous, but it's really, really important to creating a better system. Yeah, this is just a little bit of data around, we do something in January called the point in time count. So it's a one-night count of individuals experiencing homelessness in Anchorage. This includes people who are in shelters as well as individuals who are unsheltered. Then this is one night in January. So it's not necessarily reflective of the entirety of who experiences homelessness in a year. But as you can see, we don't have this year's numbers on this graph, but these numbers have stayed fairly stable over the past several years. Obviously, our goal is we want these numbers to decrease. Yeah, it is worth acknowledging that, a lot of other communities have seen significant increases in the past few years. So we are glad that we haven't seen significant increases, but obviously there's tons of work to be done to achieve that goal of making homelessness rare, brief, and one time. Another thing I think worth acknowledging, obviously so many different types of people experience homelessness. This includes youth, families, elders, veterans, people with disabilities, all different types of people. And it does include, individuals that we see in camps or on street corners. So it definitely includes those people, but it also, those people are only a small percentage of the many people in our community struggling with houselessness. And yeah, we kind of see that those most at risk of homelessness include elders, individuals with disabilities, as well as individuals who have been formerly incarcerated. And then, of course, in our community, like all other communities, with COVID, we have seen an increase in numbers of individuals and families with economic challenges, which leads to homelessness. Next slide, please. And this so that previous slide just showed kind of overall, or that one night in January of who's experiencing homelessness. And this shows a more accurate reflection of who is experiencing homelessness throughout the year. This is from the HMIS system that Christina mentioned. So just looking at the numbers served, as you can see in Anchorage, from 2019, where it was a little bit less than 8,000 to 2020, where it's about 9,500. There was a pretty significant increase. And this includes those who showed up in shelters, individuals who were served by homeless, and individuals who were served by homeless service providers. And you can see on the far right that this increase is also reflected throughout the state of Alaska, not just in Anchorage, which obviously makes sense. And I think it's important to recognize that many people are assisted by programs and successfully transition into housing, that these services and the work that is being done in our community, it is working, and many people are able to be served, but also recognizing there's a lot more, there's a lot of room for improvement and a lot more more resources and systemic changes we need to truly address homelessness. Next slide, please. Another thing I think important to recognize in talking about homelessness is that while many factors can and do lead to homelessness, lack of affordable and accessible housing is the biggest driver of homelessness. We already had a significant lack of affordable housing in Anchorage and throughout our state prior to COVID. And then, the economic impacts of COVID have only increased this even further. And I think we ask a lot, like, how do we address homelessness? And obviously there's a lot of different things here, but I also think the answer is fairly straightforward in that, we address homelessness with housing. Every single person experiencing homelessness needs affordable and safe housing to end their cycle of homelessness. Next slide, please. So at ACH, our goal is to kind of build a full continuum of evidence-based, cost-effective interventions to make homelessness rare, brief, and one time. Depending on the need of an individual, this can look like a lot of different things. One person might have a temporary job loss and simply need a modest amount of help so they can stay where they currently are until they can return to work. Something like this we would call prevention. Other individuals may have been homeless for many years and may also experience a significant disability. This person likely needs long-term financial and case management support. And this person might best be served by something we would call permanent supportive housing. Many people fall somewhere in between these two examples I gave. There's a whole spectrum of needs and support depending on the individual. Next slide, please. It is important, especially for the most vulnerable clients, that housing not just be housing, but that it be paired with supportive services to create something called the Housing First model. Housing First is different than the way things have been done historically, where a client must earn their way or achieve housing readiness. In the past, things worked so that things operated in a way so, like, if you get sober, then you can move into transitional housing. And then if you get a job, we can assist you with permanent housing and so on. However, research has shown that people are better able to make positive changes if they have access to housing and they have a stable place to stay. This makes logical sense. Trying to do something like reduce your drinking while sleeping outside every night can be very challenging, as can finding a job when you may not have a place to shower or get a restful night's sleep. The Housing First model helps people get into housing as quickly as possible without preconditions. So we believe that if we can quickly provide someone with a stable place to stay, then from there, they can work on achieving other goals. It is important that this housing include other wraparound services for clients to pursue their goals once they have stable housing without requiring certain criteria to be met prior to housing. Next slide. Housing First. This Housing First model is an example of harm reduction and is an evidence-based, cost-effective way to assist clients. An example I can think of is I worked with a client a couple years ago who was I came into contact with this person through the fire department, actually reached out to me because this person was one of the top users of emergency services that year, regularly calling ambulances and spending lots of time in the emergency room. This individual also struggled with substance use. We were able to work together and move this person into a local permanent supportive housing project. Once living there, this individual's drinking decreased significantly, and their use of emergency services also decreased dramatically. As you can see from this example, obviously this, most importantly, this helped the client. This helped the person be in an environment that was safe, where they had stability, they had people around them checking on them and helping them achieve their goals. But this also saved the system money. This with the decrease in the ambulance rides in the ER, stays, this also was an extremely cost-effective way to do things. So Carlick Manor in Anchorage is an example of a local housing first project, which is specifically for individuals with a history of substance misuse disorder. And then Forget-Me-Not Manor in Juneau as well is also an example of a housing first model. And our hope at ACH is for all programs to operate from a housing first model, as we have lots of data to show that this is effective for clients as well as cost effective. Next slide. And just to touch a little bit on what some of this has looked like in the time of COVID. As I mentioned, there's been an significant economic impacts that have led to a rise in homelessness. With this, some programs have been able to reduce barriers of individuals getting into them. Robin will be sharing more about this, but shelters had to quickly adapt to maintain the safety of their residents and maintain social distancing. New shelters were stood up to accommodate the social distancing as well as the increased need for shelter. We have also worked with Visit Healthcare to do COVID testing and vaccines for unsheltered clients who may not otherwise access these things. Outreach has also worked with 4As to offer things like needle exchanges and HIV testing, and shelters have worked collaboratively to provide these things to their residents. So these are just a few examples of kind of, what some things that have been done in the time of COVID. I will go ahead and, this is just an overview of kind of what's happening in Anchorage, but I know many of you are from outside of Anchorage as well, so I'll go ahead and hand it over to Brian, who can kind of share a statewide perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Annie. That was such a wonderful presentation. And yes, I'm going to click over to the next slide and invite Brian on.
Hello, everybody. Let me turn my fan off here. I'm not really sure how many of you are in Southeast Alaska right now, but we're going through a heat wave. It's 54 degrees here. It's really, I'm getting sweaty in my office here, so just bear with me as we go. So thank you first to my co-presenters, Christina, for your powerful testimony and truth-telling, and for Annie for kind of introducing the work that we do. The Anchorage Coalition on Homelessness work hand in hand with our statewide coalition to do everything we can to prevent and end homelessness. It's that simple. That's the job that we do. Again, for those who don't know me, my name is Brian Wilson. I use he, him, his pronouns. I work for the Alaska Coalition on Housing and Homelessness. As I mentioned, our office is located here in Juneau on beautiful Linkadani. But our region is everywhere else in the state besides Anchorage. So we have a very challenging task in front of us to try to prevent and end homelessness in the largest geographic region in the country when we're talking about continuum of care organizations. It's over 660,000 square miles, and it's great to see that the folks who are in the participants list here, you see a lot of names that I'm familiar with from all over the state. So it's great to have you as experts in this call. I feel like I gain all of my wisdom from everybody that's doing this work on the ground across the state, and so I really deeply appreciate your participation with our coalition. If you aren't familiar with the Alaska Coalition, we do a few things. One, we manage federal housing grants, HUD grants. There's the Continuum Care Grant, which provides funding for 12 different permanent supportive housing and transitional housing programs across the state. And we also, this last year, received the Youth Homelessness Demonstration Program grant, which is about to stand up 8 brand new programs focused at preventing and ending youth homelessness across the state as well. We're very excited to see that come online. As Annie and Christina were referencing, we co-manage the AKHMIS database, which is basically all of the client level information that is entered by our agencies across the state. And we do a lot of advocacy and education, which you'll probably hear the advocacy tone come out from me because I can't help it on this call, but we do a lot of talking about ways that we can better serve our clients. So I mentioned earlier, we have this huge geography. It's a challenge to not just from a geographic standpoint where we don't have transportation systems, we can't easily get clients to resources that exist. A lot of times clients are in communities where there aren't any services available for their specific needs. We'll talk about that in a minute. But also homelessness just looks different depending on where you're at. If you're in Fairbanks or Juneau, it's probably looking more like you would expect in terms of like an urban area. But in many of our communities where there's no existing homeless providers there in the area, and that's really harsh weather conditions, homelessness oftentimes looks like severe overcrowding. And as we know, in Alaska, we have the highest rates in the nation in many parts of our state. As before, as Andy mentioned, like what causes homelessness? The number one reason is a lack of housing. We have a severe infrastructure shortage in Alaska. So it's like we have all of these things going, in the way of us accomplishing our mission. And that's sort of the parameters that we have to operate in. So there's a lot of creativity. And I really send kudos to our advocates and our program managers and staff across the state. They are they do their work with a lot of ingenuity. They do their work in an underfunded environment, and they make the most of what they have. So appreciate all of that. So we can go on to the next slide. Annie really did a great job introducing what harm reduction looks like in the housing world. I always throw up this slide here because I feel like it really displays the old way we operated in the housing world versus the way that I'm hesitant to say new way because I don't feel like we're there yet, but we're moving in that direction. Housing readiness was the traditional, like you have to address your mental health, your behavioral or substance misuse issues, your income issues, any other kind of issues that may be contributing towards your homelessness in order to become ready or eligible to receive a housing voucher. And oftentimes there are even steps thrown in the way, like, okay, you got to hit the shelter system, then you got to go to transitional housing, work on yourself, and then you're able to receive permanent housing. To me, when I entered this field, it was post housing first, and I just couldn't imagine like coming with that mindset of somebody who's experiencing trauma, active trauma. Maybe they're fleeing a bad situation from their house, or they just got fired from their job, or they're dealing with addiction issues, or really struggling with mental health issues. How the heck is somebody supposed to get in and address those issues that take time and a stable environment if they're spending all of their cognitive time and resources to finding a single safe and stable roof over their head that night? It does not work. It does not work at all. And so I am so happy to see that we have stood up a lot of programs in the state that take a housing first approach, which is understanding that none of those things can be addressed until somebody has some sort of safe and stable housing. And that can look like a lot of different things. Sometimes we get too focused and it's just permanent supportive housing is housing first. It's any safe and stable housing that we can get. It could be staying with friends and family, diverting out of the homeless system. It could be in a domestic violence shelter because they are fleeing a situation where there are trained professionals there to help them address their needs, or it could be just temporary rental assistance. The key is they all have in common, let's get a roof over your head and you surrounded with resources, not just housing, it's housing and resources together. So you've probably heard of some of the unique programs that Alaska does have that are super effective. When we're talking about like permanent supportive housing in the balance estate, we manage several different programs, but we have a really unique program in Juneau called the Juneau Housing First Forget Me Not Banner. It's about to go into its second phase, which is going to double the capacity of this program. They have 32 units right now. It's going to go to 64. And I'm not really sure if you ever have a chance to come to Juneau post-COVID in a safe way. go visit it, because you'll be visiting one of 4 permanent supportive housing programs in the nation that has a co-located behavioral health clinic in it. That's incredible. You literally walk through a door and you're right there at a waiting room. And so we're talking about reducing barriers to getting services and not requiring services, but presenting them in a way and an environment that is successful for somebody experiencing trauma. That's about as poster child of a program as you can do. But also, if you're up in the Fairbanks region, really successful Housing First program called My Place. It's managed by the Fairbanks Rescue Mission. It's a rapid rehousing program funded by the Alaska Mental Health Trust Authority. And they recognize that, hey, we have a lot of folks here that just need either temporary assistance or permanent supports, supportive services, but maybe not a permanent household. Like they just are right at that edge where they can just need some time to stabilize, get some income, address behavioral health, mental health. And so they stood up a program to provide up to 24 months of rental assistance and other housing move-in supports, and surrounding those clients with case management. And their success rates there in terms of like returns to homelessness, increases of income are really in many cases higher than what you would look for in programs in the lower 48. And so they're doing that with a lot fewer resources and a lot higher challenges than other areas. So definitely a couple of places to look at. There's some great research by UAA and UAS on the outcomes of the Housing First program. So definitely want to look at that. But what I wanted to kind of focus on today, I didn't want to just like slam you with numbers. So I'm going to slam you with a map. And I always do the map, but it's important because I'm going to keep presenting the map until things change. So what you're looking at here is basically all of our emergency shelter, rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing, transitional housing beds per capita by census area. It's a heat map. So if your community is green there, that means you're doing a decent job. You got some resources in your community that we can use to try to house individuals in. If your area is red, there's likely little to no resources available in your community. So as you see in the dark green areas there, you got Juneau, you got Anchorage, is that little dot right there. And then Fairbanks, they naturally have the most resources, as we typically see funding go towards urban centers. In our world, in the balance of state, you probably noticed I was only mentioning our urban centers in terms of like successful programs. It's not that we don't have any successful programs in our more rural areas, it's just that they're very few and far between. And if you look at what programs we do have, or even resources in general for homelessness, you can't just look at number of beds, because not all beds are for all people. Homelessness does not look the same for every person. Obviously, so in Christina's world, they oversee a network of domestic violence housing and shelter options across the state. Obviously, those units are not reserved for every single individual. It's for individuals fleeing a domestic violence or trafficking situation. So what I did was created a second map that was going to look at, okay, let's take that DV specific beds out of this number, and let's go to the next map and see what it looks like. So as you can see, the whole state basically gets red. We have a somewhat, Alaska terms, robust speaking domestic violence shelter network out there, which is great. We definitely need it. We don't have enough, so we need more of that resource out there. But in terms of like just beds for anybody of any type, we have almost nothing in the balance of state. It's a very hard reality to deal with. It's very hard to do harm reduction and housing first principles when you don't have a place to put somebody. And that is, we cannot fully adopt. That's why I was saying I hate to say housing first is a new approach in the state, because I don't feel like we're there yet, because unless we invest and stand up resources in these rural communities, we cannot fulfill housing first philosophies, because there's nowhere to put anybody. And that's a hard stop. And so that's where our advocacy comes in, is if folks are wanting to see reductions in homelessness in this state, if they want to see reductions in homelessness in our urban areas where many people flee to, where they don't have any other connections potentially, but they just know that there might be a shelter option there. We need to invest in our entire system across the state. And it's not really housing first when your first option is 1,000 miles away on an airplane. So, yeah, I'll get off my soapbox there. So, so then we wanted to talk a little bit about COVID. They wanted to tie me in and say, okay, well, how did COVID affect things? Well, I'm sure that Robin's going to have something to say about that. But basically, if I could just put it in a nutshell, COVID has sent our homeless response system into an absolute spiral. We, in basically a one-day turnaround, had to communicate down new CDC requirements to all of our programs across the state that they must adopt these to safely house their clients. And many of these programs that are trying to adopt these CDC requirements, such as like decompression of shelter, additional spacing, 24-hour accommodations, many of these places were operating on volunteer, management. Many of these places have very limited staffing or people in the area that are specialized to work with these vulnerable populations. So what happens when they are exposed to COVID, or their partner that they live with is exposed to COVID and everybody has to isolate? That shuts the whole system down. And that happened time and time and time again across our state, where there was a call saying, hey, our shelter is basically an isolation space now. We cannot accept new clients. Everybody's on lockdown. What do we do? And it's like, great, I don't have an answer for that. And it's odd, because this is a very interesting time from a federal funding standpoint, that you see all these $1.9 trillion packages coming down. But in those resources that were coming down, there were very few of which that we were able to have the flexibility to take dollars and take someone that's literally homeless and put them somewhere. There were a lot of restrictions around it. We have $300 million of emergency rental assistance funding out there, which is fantastic. We need to stop the inflow into our system, because it is, we have seen increases over the past 14 months to our system. So emergency rental assistance is great, but that's for housed people. And so the flexible money, when that first came down in the CARES package, for the most part, was allocated from the governor to local municipalities and boroughs that don't do this work already. Like in a lot of these communities, it's just nonprofits and churches, doing the work. And so they wouldn't know or have an informed way how to allocate these funds. And so we saw a lot of those flexible dollars just fill budget gaps. Here we are with ARPA that's coming down right now. And we have just over $1 billion of, fairly flexible funding coming in, but we have an $800 million gap in our budget at state level. And so it's like, I can see the use of those dollars to help support our economy, because our economy needs help. But it is very challenging right now for us as advocates and housers to, get that message across, that like, look, this is our opportunity to move from the old way of, the non-harm reduction way of just putting people in shelters and waiting for them to self-resolve their issues, and shift us into a new paradigm in this state, which is true harm reduction, which is true housing first. The money is there, and it's just going to take somebody to prioritize it. It is not this has never happened before, where we've had an opportunity to do it. And I am fighting like heck across the street to try to get that message, in place, but I am calling upon everybody. I'm not sure if I'm even allowed to do this on this call, but calling on everybody to call your people that are representing you and let them know that this is a need, and this is a one-time opportunity for us to stand and follow our best practices and do it. Because we're talking, and Robin's going to see this, we have potential for the Sullivan Center to shut down in August, that is currently housing hundreds of people that we have nowhere to put them. So where are they going to go? Where are they going to go? So anyways, sorry, I'm getting all rounds up here. It's Tuesday. So anyways, on the screen, I'm probably over time, but there's a great communities dashboard that shows information down to the local level that you can use if you are talking to somebody that is supposed to represent us, and you can display the need there. But also understand that this does not include DV data in it. And so there are a lot more people in these communities because the VAWA does not allow us to report on those things, which is good. And then also this does not represent any area that doesn't have housing resources in it. So just if you're seeing your community and there's a big fat 0 in terms of total clients, that just means that you need to get some resources in your community to start counting them. It doesn't mean they don't exist. We can't just continue this way of like saying, well, it just doesn't exist there. So, but anyways, I want to like pass my time here, and there's probably some Q&A. I'll let Robin talk about all the great work that she's doing, but thanks everybody for this opportunity for me to get on a soapbox.